Tonight, Alexei Navalny predicts his own demise in an interview acquired by Sky News. Before his death and his first poisoning, he accused a network of London lawyers of serving the interests of bandits. So is he still right? In a never-before-seen exchange, the Putin critic condemned corrupt officials in the UK's capital for allegedly helping stash dirty Russian money.
Why do corrupt officials still live in London? Because these corrupt officials feed a huge number of wonderful London lawyers.
The Foreign Office insists 2,000 Russian individuals and groups have been targeted by sanctions. We'll be assessing just how effective they have been. Also coming up, the American soldier who fatally set himself on fire because of the war in Gaza. Airman Aaron Bushnell described it as an extreme act of protest. We'll be talking about the long history of self-immolation in conflict. Plus, Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari tells me why the battle for Israel's soul keeps him up at night. And what should the world do about the wives and children of Islamic State fighters? Tonight, we'll hear the desperate pleas of mothers trapped in Syria. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. We begin tonight with one man's vision of what could have been. Alexei Navalny looks fit and healthy as he speaks about his fight against corruption in Russia. The vocal critic of Vladimir Putin is smiling, optimistic even, as he suggests that in 10 years' time he hopes to have helped root out money laundering. That was 4 years ago. We now know, of course, that he doesn't live to see that dream come true. Soon he'll be buried by his family after his death at an Arctic penal colony. Russian authorities say he died of natural causes. His family insist he was poisoned, but his words live on in a haunting way. In a never-before-seen interview acquired by Sky News, Navalny is highly critical of corrupt officials in the UK who enable Russians to buy respectability with their millions. One of his close friends who lives in exile here goes even further, describing the sanctions imposed after his death as weak, pathetic and laughable. Strong criticism, yes, but is it valid? Could the West do more? We'll be discussing that in a moment, but let's get started with a report from our International Affairs editor, Dominique Waghorn.
He was a man with a deep love for his country and a profound belief in a better future for Russia.
I'm an optimist. I hope that this 20 years of Putin is not set in stone. We weren't doomed to it. We weren't meant to go in that direction.
The interview acquired by Sky News and never seen before is one of the last Alexei Navalny would give in full health. A few months later, he was poisoned before his 3 years in jail and then death in an Arctic labour camp. The interview shows Navalny for what he was, a young, charismatic politician offering an alternative to the theft and corruption of Putin.
The entire Putin elite is absolutely corrupt, and it is absolutely colonially minded. They have moved all their families, their children, their assets to the West. And they treat our country as a free hunting zone, and that's exactly how it works.
Navalny and his organisation fought with extraordinary courage against that alleged corruption with video exposés claiming to show the lavish lifestyles of Putin and his elite. Work, he says, the state did what it could to destroy.
They tried to prevent us from shooting our videos, because the main and most important way to spread information in Russia right now is YouTube. It will probably be difficult to find a single person in our office who has not been arrested for a period of 10, 15 or 30 days. And many have criminal cases against them that are either suspended or ongoing.
And in a poignant moment in the interview, Alexei Navalny makes it clear he knew the risks he was running.
Those who try to resist, let's say, they face the consequences quite quickly.
But some of Navalny's strongest words are against the West, and Britain in particular, for letting Putin and his cronies allegedly get away with it.
The West does nothing at all, I would say. There are some ritual dances, but nothing really happens. Why do corrupt officials still live in London? Because these corrupt officials feed a huge number of wonderful London lawyers. These people, they will appear very civilized. We will be pleased to chat with them if they sit next to us. They will be wearing a tie and fine manners, and at the same time, they are serving the interests of utter, complete bandits.
It is a damning indictment of the way Britain has allegedly let Putin's cronies stash their dirty money abroad. Britain has imposed more sanctions on Russia since, but anti-corruption investigators say still not enough is being done to stop what Navalny campaigned against.
This isn't just about hiding money and suspicious wealth and getting it out of countries where the predicate offence of corruption has occurred in the first place. It's allowing people who are opposed to the rules-based international order to buy access, reputation, and influence in democratic societies on an industrial scale.
The UK government has told Sky News it sanctioned 2,000 individuals, companies and groups and is targeting Putin-linked elites in the UK. Corruption and kleptocracy, we were told, is not welcome on these shores. But there's still controversy over the UK's limited action following Navalny's death, targeting only officials in charge of his jail. Russians in exile who knew Navalny, like journalist Yulia Maneva, say he'd have regarded the latest sanctions as laughable.
He liked humour, so I feel like he would laugh at this point because of what we've seen in recent days. If this is everything that we're going to see from the UK in the response of Navalny's death, it looks quite weak and a bit pathetic.
Despite all Putin's Russia did to him, Alexei Navalny remained positive to the end, smiling in his last court appearance the day before his death. For him, the Putin years have been an aberration. Russia's destiny, he believed, is a freer future. His death, though, cast that even deeper into doubt. His final thoughts in this interview, now all the more haunting.
Russia is a European country. All the people who live here want to live like Europe. So I hope that 10 years from now, if you interview me again, I'll be able to tell you how we managed to overcome the corrupt money laundering.
That piece by Dominic Waghorn and Dom's here with me now alongside Matthew Torn, a director and filmmaker who made the documentary series After the Fall, in which this interview was featured, and Anna Nemtsova, a correspondent at the Daily Beast and contributing writer for The Atlantic. Thank you all for joining us. Dom, I'll come to you first. I mean, this whole notion of Londongrad, it is a nickname that people associate with this city. Yeah,
and it's very fitting. And I think what Alexei Navalny said very clearly and articulately in that very passionately, as he did, characteristically, was that the Russian elite, the Putin elite, regard Russia as a hunting ground. They're colonialists in their own country. So they've kind of raped and pillaged and looted the wealth of their country as sort of the hydrocarbon oligarchical gangsters that they are. And then they've tried to stash the cash outside of Russia in the West where it would be safe. And what they've tried to do is buy respectability, buy kind of a different kind of life. So they are gangsters, but they've bought themselves this veneer of respectability. And there has been a whole industry of lawyers, accountants, visa operatives, all these kind of people in London who, as he says, they're dressed very well, they wear ties, they have great manners, you'd love to sit next to them at a dinner party, but actually what they're doing is enabling bandits, in his words, gangsters, to acquire a more respectable life. Now, it's important to say this happened 4 years ago. I'm so grateful to Anna and Matthew for letting us use this interview, because it shows Navalny at the sort of at his height when it was a few months before he was poisoned, so at his healthiest, and I think probably at his most articulate, as he's talking very passionately about what happened then. Since then, the British government has said today that it's pointed out that 2,000 individuals and companies have been sanctioned, that kleptocracy and corruption is not tolerated here. But it has to be said that, Transparency International, other groups would say they've not gone far enough. And I think there's huge disenchantment amongst particularly Russian exiles, as we heard from Yulia Maneva there, in the wake of the limited sanctions imposed after Navalny's death. They've literally, the government targeted a handful of prison officials at the Labour camp where he was imprisoned. And as we heard from Yulia there, and she's not the only one, a lot of people would say that's just not enough. It's almost ridiculous. And saying, actually, Alexei, would have laughed at it. He had a good sense of humour and he would have laughed at it and regarded it as laughable and risible.
Yeah, I mean, we heard there, some of the criticism around this, that some of his closest associates have said this is comical, it's ridiculous. But Matthew, if I just bring you in before we start talking about Navalny, if we talk about the kind of money and the sanctions imposed, I mean, these sanctions, everyone sort of works around them, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, those sanctions don't really have any significant impact because you can just do business via Kazakhstan or Georgia or Kyrgyzstan. But what we were looking at, was illegal, but it didn't make any difference. It was money laundering, and this is why we spoke to Navalny. And we were looking precisely at how the money gets to London, so how Londongrad becomes Londongrad. And what we discovered was that, you have these, as Dominic described them as sort of gangster oligarchs, Putin's cronies, who siphon money off state-owned companies, off the government budget. But they need to get this money out of Russia, and they want to get it to the West, into London. And the way they do that is they use organised crime money laundering networks, but they don't trust the organised crime figures, so they infiltrate these networks using FSB spies, the KGB successor. And they now have the FSB controlling these money laundering networks, and they pump $20 billion a year for more than 10 years, and that was just through Danske, so that's huge.
And these are the things that made Navalny angry, and he wanted to speak up and confront it.
When we spoke with him, he was seemingly angry, actually, because again and again, and we interviewed him because he was an expert of the anatomy of Russian corruption. By then, he had done numerous reports that Russians watched and loved, millions of Russians. Russians are actually very angry when they hear about Russian corrupt public officials run away to places like Geneva or London or Miami, and to enjoy democracy, enjoy great education, great medical service, and live in luxurious apartments. So he was angry because many times he was knocking at different doors. He came here to London with his reports, and he talked about particular houses in London that belonged to corrupt Russian elite. But there was no reaction, he said. He was angry that everybody understands that there are gangsters in Russia, but they would dress up in good suits, sit down, smoke cigars, and talk with these gangsters rather than fighting them. And that resulted, that tragic story, resulted with the war we have today and the end of Russian democracy.
It's hard to overstate the loss of Navalny in all of this, because he was such a powerful voice, and he was a voice that scared Putin.
He was an optimist, and thank you for quoting him in the very end of the interview. He optimistically predicts that in 10 years we'll talk about our victory, how we beat corruption in Russia. I'm sure that there are a lot of other investigative reporters who are either in exile or in Russia, and they continue to investigate. But we here in the West, just to honor Navalny, we really need to look at ourselves in Geneva, in Luxembourg, in Miami, in London, and think about people in Kramatorsk or about in, Bucha, Lysychansk, which are cities in Europe. Because in Russia, we don't have democracy anymore, and in Ukraine, they have massacre.
And Matthew, I mean, if we talk about the work that you guys have done and what Navalny was so passionate about, we hear these condemnations, but very little is ever done about it. We know that the money is stashed here. Officials know.
Yeah, of course the officials know. I mean, the British establishment is kind of part and parcel of it. Families that are in the top 10 wealthiest families in Britain made their money in the 1990s in Russia's aluminium industry through teaming up with gangsters, and then they laundered that money out of the country. And these people are giving money to Boris Johnson and are applauded when they visit Downing Street. So it's all part and parcel. I don't think Navalny talks about this network of, he talks about an infrastructure of lawyers, lobbyists, bankers who sort of help perpetuate this system, but they essentially make the government's, whether the government has half-hearted attempts or full-throated attempts, they neutralise these attempts. And what was interesting is if you look at the Magnitsky Act, You would think that passing the Magnitsky Act would have been a no-brainer, that it would have been easy, but it wasn't. There was great resistance, both in Britain and in the US, to pass an act that was designed to put sanctions on corrupt government officials, human rights abusers. I mean, one has to ask, why is the reluctance?
Yeah, Dom, I mean, there was a great push for dossiers to be released, for names to be made public, for more to be done, and there wasn't.
Yeah, and I think there's been a kind of ambivalence. So on the one hand, people have said more needs to be done. On the other side, a huge amount of money has been made and a blind eye has been turned. And a lot of that money has gone into politics and supporting different parties and vested interests. You know, London, and in particular in Britain, has profited from this and has been weak on this very ill-gotten amount of money that's been swilling around the UK. And as Anna was saying, that has led to where we are now because it showed weakness. It showed that we had a tolerance for this kind of corruption. And in Putin's mind, therefore, we were somebody who could be taken advantage of and played. Had we taken a firmer line earlier on with this corrupt money, then he may have had more respect for the West. But it's all part of this pattern of being too weak on Putin and not deterring him earlier on. So we're in this situation now where he's invaded another country and may well move on from that if he prevails in Ukraine.
I know we have 30 seconds left on this segment, but I guess, you know, you knew Navalny, you'd worked alongside him. How do you think he would ultimately want to be remembered and the causes that he fought for? Because he did some of the biggest documentaries and investigations on Putin's corruption and corruption of these oligarchs.
He would like to see people punished, criminals punished, corrupt public officials punished, both in Russia and on the West.
Anna, Matthew, Dom, thank you all. Stay with me because coming up we'll be discussing Israel's aims in Gaza. I'll ask Israeli historian and author Yuval Noah Harari what keeps him up at night, and we'll report on the American soldier who set himself alight to protest against the war.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over. Christchurch has been changed forever by what happened here.
There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque. That's a scene that you don't forget.
Ida has certainly left its mark on New Orleans.
It just feels heartbreaking.
We help you understand the world with us. We are standing on the supply line right into the heart of America's opioid crisis. I've reported from around the world and around the UK. Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who've made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Joe Biden knows the celebrations are over, and this is a country in crisis.
You don't want to be remembered this way. You always want to be remembered as something positive.
It is almost impossible to predict where these fires will go next. This gives you an idea of the strength of those winds, strong enough to bend and twist metal.
You regret the tweet, Gary?
There's no sign, publicly at least, of either side being willing to give ground. How do you reassure the public that all of these mistakes wouldn't be made again? I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Welcome back. A serving member of the US Air Force has died after setting himself on fire in front of Israel's embassy in Washington. Aaron Bushnell had said he no longer wanted to be complicit in what he described as genocide in Gaza. Tonight, the Pentagon described his death as a tragic event. Our US correspondent James Matthews reports.
It was outside the Israeli embassy that Aaron Bushnell staged his protest, live streaming it on social media. We won't show the moment when he set himself alight, but it was immediately beforehand that the US airman explained his actions.
I am an active duty member of the United States Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal.
At the gates of the embassy, the 25-year-old from San Antonio in Texas poured liquid over his head and set light to it, shouting, "Free Palestine." He died from his injuries in hospital.
The Secretary is following the situation. I know the Air Force has confirmed the airman's death. They do plan to provide additional information 24 hours after next of kin notifications are complete. It certainly is a tragic event. We do extend our condolences to the airman's family.
It was by no means the first act of protest in the United States, a country of significant influence over war in the Middle East. Conflict there stirs strong emotions here, a reality laid bare in shocking terms on Sunday. James Matthews, Sky News in Washington.
Today, I asked a prominent Israeli historian what keeps him up at night. Yuval Noah Harari told me it wasn't Hamas, not Hezbollah, not even Iran. Instead, it was the struggle for the soul of his country. The best-selling author of *Sapiens* has spent the past few months trying to present some of his biggest ideas to a much younger audience, launching his new book for kids, Unstoppable Us. I asked him why he felt he needed to speak directly to them. Have a listen.
For the first time, we have no idea how the world would look like when the children of today are themselves grown-ups. Nobody knows what the job market, what the economy, what society would look like in 10 or 20 years. And to deal with the unknown, history is always an important key. And certainly when it comes to the big questions of politics and economics, why are there so many wars in the world?
If you look at the state of the world, it continues to happen, and it is a tool that people use first before talking, first before dialogue or diplomacy.
As a historian, I think the most important thing to realize, it's a human choice. Wars are never inevitable among humans. Some people think that humans fight for the same reason that wolves and chimpanzees fight, that we fight over food and territory, and this is just part of the objective nature of things. And this is almost never the case. Most wars in history are not really about food or territory. They are about the stories that we imagine in our own minds. And I look at the war between Israelis and Palestinians, for instance. There is, objectively speaking, there is enough land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River to build houses and schools and hospitals for everyone. There is enough food to feed everybody. People don't really fight about food. They fight about the imaginary stories in their heads, and they can't find a common story.
So we have a situation, if we look at the situation in the Middle East, where October 7, a horrific event that took place, 1,200 people were left dead, and it shocked Israel. It shocked Israel on so many levels. We now have a situation where almost 30,000 Palestinians have been killed. In total, they say 100,000 Palestinians have been killed, injured, missing. Do you think that the response was the right response? As a historian, as someone who understands the pain of Israel as well and the tragedy of the Palestinians?
If you go back to the 7th of October, or you go back thousands of years, Israelis and Palestinians tell a very different historical narrative, and therefore they understand justice differently, and there is no way really to reconcile it. You will never get them to agree. The key is to shift the discussion from a discussion about justice to a discussion about peace. You can't agree what justice is, but peace is much more objective because are people being killed or not? That's an objective thing.
What keeps you up at night with this conflict? What do you fear most?
Personally, I feel most for really the soul of my country, of my nation. In Israel at the moment, there is really a battle for the soul of the Israeli nation between patriotism on the one side and ideas of Jewish supremacy on the other side. The current government, it has elements which are anti-Zionist, are against the secular nationalism that built Israel, and are in favor of Jewish supremacy. And you know, there is a very important line in the for every nation between patriotism and feelings of supremacy. To be a patriot is to acknowledge the uniqueness of your nation. And every nation is unique. There is nothing wrong about feeling that my nation is unique and it has a right to develop its unique traditions and cultures and so forth. And it doesn't prevent you from recognizing the uniqueness of other nations and their rights to live in dignity and prosperity. The danger comes when you start thinking that my nation is not just unique, it is supreme. And it has rights which override the right of anybody else. And now there is a huge titanic struggle within Israel between these two forces. And this is my greatest fear. It's not from Hamas, it's not from Hezbollah, it's not from Iran. It's from this inner struggle that we might lose this struggle.
Well, one of the objectives at the very beginning of this conflict was that eliminating Hamas. Mm-hmm. There are many now coming out at the beginning of the conflict, but now saying that Hamas is a political movement. You can't kill an ideology. Do you fear that something more violent, more brutal will come out of this, given we have 17,000 orphans now as a result of this conflict?
So I think that, again, you can't eliminate Hamas, but it is necessary to eliminate at least most of its military capabilities. Of course, as you say, something even worse might replace it. So it's not enough to eliminate the military capabilities of Hamas. We have to struggle, and I'm talking about when we say we, Israel, to present the Palestinians with a better future than what Hamas is offering. And a better future means to have dignified lives in the Palestinian homeland.
But here we are today, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying, even if the hostages are released, we will go into Rafah. Do you think that this is the right sort of objective and plan?
I still haven't heard from him a clear statement about what are the long-term political aims of the war. Like, how do you envision our region, the Middle East, 2 years, 5 years down the line?
So then what advice would you give the future generations?
The most important skills has to do with emotional intelligence. That the only thing we know about the future is that it will be very different from the present, and it will change at a very, very rapid pace. This will create tremendous psychological stress, because change is always stressful. And we need to prepare for it, not just as individuals, but also as societies.
Yuval Noah Harari, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That was Yuval Noah Harari speaking to me a little earlier today. Let's bring in our studio guests this evening. David Patrick Karakas, a foreign correspondent at Unheard, and Donald McIntyre, former political editor and foreign correspondent at The Independent. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us. Donald, I'll come to you just picking up on what Yuval Noah Harari was saying there. He was saying, look, we're 4.5 months, 5 months into this conflict, and there is very little clarity from Benjamin Netanyahu as to what the strategy for this conflict is?
Well, I mean, I have a great deal of sympathy with him. It hasn't been at all clear from... it's been clear that, since Netanyahu said on the night of October the 7th that he was going to exact mighty vengeance in return for the terrible atrocities that were committed by Hamas on October the 7th, it's been very difficult to discern a straightforward plan other than his repeatedly stated objective of destroying Hamas, which, as Yuval Harari says, as an ideology, isn't really something you can do. Hamas isn't a building that you can blow up. And although he has now produced a kind of plan which, is really just basically to keep Gaza under as much Israeli control as possible, both militarily and to some extent politically. It isn't a plan, as Harari says. It isn't a plan for the Middle East. It isn't a plan for the Palestinians. And it's depressing that, 30,000 people have died for a war that I think even the army are beginning to get restive about the lack of a sense of the future.
David, what's your take on it? You've spent time in Israel, you've spoken to the IDF. What's sort of your take on what we're seeing unfold in the Middle East at the moment?
So I arrived in Israel shortly after October 7th, and I was actually in the room when they screened the full uncensored footage, such as that they were willing to show to us, of the October 7th atrocities. And it was clear that we're dealing with like a traumatised people, right? There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of rage. And I was speaking to the IDF, and fair enough anger, fair enough rage. And they were telling me, I was saying, what's the plan? And they're like, we are going to ensure that Hamas is never in a position to govern Gaza to do this again. Fine. So you're going to occupy it again? No. So you want the Palestinian Authority to occupy it again, or to govern it again? No. So what's the plan? In and of itself, I understand. Let's just talk about the practicalities. Israel is responsible for its own people. You saw 1,400 people killed. I mean, take that with the British population, it's 10,000. You've got to do something, fine, I accept that. But the problem is this, that in and of itself, the ideology, as Donald said, to destroy Hamas is not achievable, right? We accept that. I think people on the ground know that. So what is actually happening now? I understand the need to go into Gaza. I understand the need to degrade their terrorist capabilities. And look, when I was there shortly after October 7th, we were going into bunkers in Israel, fairly frequently because the missiles were coming in. I was there last week, it's far, far less. So they are degrading their capabilities. But what is the end game now? Because defeating and destroying Hamas is not achievable.
And the way they've gone about it, do you agree with that?
Look, I mean, in the final analysis, the problem with Hamas is, as Don said, there is no building you can destroy. They don't have bases, and they do meld in with the civilians. They have tunnels under Gaza because they cannot, have bases overground. So the problem is, how do you do this? You have to do something. I think with this window they were given possibly by the Americans, if you really want to do this in a military sense, it's going to take a year and a half. They're trying to do it much quicker, so everything is much blunter.
I think it's very complicated by the issue of the hostages, which I think is becoming, it's causing more and more tension within Israel. And, there is a conflict between getting the hostages out, or a lot of military experts, people more experts in military matters than me, feel that these two objectives are not really compatible. Although Netanyahu keeps saying, we're going to destroy Hamas and we're going to bring all the hostages back. I mean, a ceasefire is needed for, even if you look at it specifically from Israel's point of view, if you want to get those hostages back, you really have to have a ceasefire, and possibly quite a long ceasefire.
And I guess, there's conversation around not just ending the war, but what does the day after look like?
Sure. I mean, nobody knows. And I want to talk about two things here. There is a difference, I think, between the military objectives and the political objectives. Look, the military objectives are clear. Israel has to respond to Hamas. Leaving everything aside, you cannot have October the 7th and not do anything. You have to degrade their capabilities.
Did Gaza need to be flattened in the process? Could it have been done in a sort of...
Yes, I think so. If the IDF always said this would take much longer than the political window they had. But my point is something slightly different. When we talk about Netanyahu, I believe we're talking about a man, a demagogue, You know, a populist doesn't even go far enough. This is a man who wants to stay out of jail, who's only concerned about his political future. Now, if we talk about the day after, by any laws of political gravity, he should be finished. We remember the disaster from the Israeli viewpoint of October of the Yom Kippur War.
Heads rolled.
The post-mortem brought down Golda Meir, brought down Moshe Dayan.
And in 2006, heads rolled as well.
Absolutely. So he needs to delay that as long as possible. All he wants to do is stay in power. He's brought in these extremists into the government. He's weak, he's old, he just wants to stay out of jail, and he's kowtowing to these people. So we have military practical objectives sitting alongside what I would call more political ideological objectives.
I mean, I don't really disagree with that, I'm afraid. I mean, I think that it's obviously extremely important for him to remain in office, and it is becoming a criticism on what I could call the Zionist left, really, which is that, you know, that was why he didn't really want to do a hostage deal, because then you have a period, perhaps a protracted period of not being at war, and that's dangerous for his government and his coalition. I mean, it is possible that these two really extreme, I mean, frankly, quasi-fascist members of his cabinet, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, could, I'm not saying they would, but they could walk out if there was a long ceasefire. And that's very bad news for Netanyahu, because that would you know, he would lose his 64-strong Knesset majority. And just to add to what David was saying, because he's actually so unpopular, I'm not saying the war is unpopular in Israel, but he personally is unpopular, then an election is a pretty menacing prospect for him.
Indeed, and in the middle of a war as well. Donald, David, we'll keep you both here as we move to our next segment. But this is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, who should care for the children of ISIS? We travel to a camp in Syria where the wives and children of Islamic State fighters are pleading to return home, but say they've been abandoned by their government. Stay with us. Few cases are more polarising than that of Shamima Begum, the British schoolgirl who ran away to join so-called Islamic State. But last week, the Court of Appeal backed a decision to strip her British citizenship. She wants to return home, and she's not alone. Several more former ISIS brides held in the same Syrian refugee camp as Begum have told Sky News they've been abandoned alongside their children by their governments. Hundreds of families are being held in the Al-Hol camp in northeast Syria. Some of them have been speaking to our special correspondent, Alex Crawford.
Al-Roj camp in northeast Syria is filled with desperate families that nobody wants. They're families of ISIS fighters or supporters, women and children, many from the West, now abandoned by their countries. We tried to talk to the most high-profile to be stripped of her British citizenship.
Shamima.
But Shamima Begum, who ran away as a teenager, isn't talking after losing her latest legal challenge to regain it. The signs outside her tent indicate she's turned against ISIS, like all those we spoke to here told us. Many, like Shamima Begum, say they were trafficked to the Islamic State, often raped and beaten. Many have been here for more than 5 years, unable to leave, and argue they and their children are being punished for what their fathers did.
It's a bad mistake that have been made, but I want to go back.
Another Briton from Yorkshire, too scared to show her face, told us her 7-year-old son Adam, who was born in Raqqa, hadn't any future in the camp.
There's no schools, no reading or writing, nothing. And there's no doctors. And we want to get back home to trial me out over there. No, and don't do this to Adam. He's innocent.
Her story's a familiar one, with a range of different nationalities telling us they'd been forgotten or dumped by their governments.
From long time, try to escape from there, and my husband, they don't want because it's like so radical, you know, in the ideology of the Islamic State. And he says, if you try to escape, I will kill you with my hands, you know.
Zakia wants to return to Germany, saying her husband tricked her into going to Raqqa.
I tried to run away 2 times, yes, but they catch me and they beat me, and then where to go? I stay. And then he died after 5 months when I come, 2014 I come. He died and I was pregnant. What to do?
She had 2 children born in Germany and then 3 more born from forced marriages in Syria.
This one I give birth in Minbet, this one in Mayadin, and she in the camp.
In Al-Roj?
Yep.
And your older one?
She is in Germany, Stuttgart. I give birth her in Stuttgart.
Her youngest has spent all 5 years of her life in this camp, which she cannot escape. Her 2 older siblings were born whilst held by ISIS, and her 10-year-old can't remember any of her German, but knows she wants to leave Al-Roj. Here isn't good, she tells us. We're trapped like chickens. I want to go outside and go to parks.
I was born in Germany.
Many of the women appeared too frightened to be seen talking to us. There are extremist elements in this closed-off camp, which many liken to prison. And there are a lot of children.
Of the tens of thousands of people held in the 2 camps, half of them are children. 80% of them are under the age of 12 and 30% are under the age of 5. And there are human rights organisations galore saying that this is in contravention of UN rights for children.
We call him Johnny Bravo.
Kirsty is from Melbourne in Australia, and her 4-year-old was born in the camp. His older sister was 2 when they were put in here, and they dream of returning.
Like, they've done absolutely nothing wrong. I try to not explain to them that they're in like a prison type thing, but they don't understand. You know, it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to live in a closed off, with no freedom, no knowing when you're gonna be free, what's happening with you, living in limbo.
In some of the tents, they try to recreate home for their children, but they're seething with frustration.
That not just the children, but most of the women are being punished for basically a decision that was made on our behalf. And our government, even though we've reached out continuously, they're refusing to kind of acknowledge that their citizens are still remained here, trapped in the camps. You know, Australian-born children are still here. We are human beings at the end of the day. An animal won't be able to withstand these conditions. And I'm being honest with you. My son has severe asthma. I almost lost him last year. And my government is aware of this.
The boys are especially vulnerable, often taken to male prisons as soon as they reach puberty. This teenager vented much of the children's helplessness.
But my father is in prison. That's normal. We don't, my father, he done something. I'm totally okay with that because he should pay for his own mistake, not me nor my brothers.
The children here have known nothing but conflict and closed camps, and no country seems to want to take responsibility for them. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Al Roj camp in northeast Syria.
OK, let's discuss the issue of Shamima Begum and some of the others who remain in that camp in Syria. My panellists are still here with me, David and Donald. I mean, Donald, this isn't, as I said at the top of the segment, a deeply polarising issue.
Yeah, I guess it is a polarising issue in that every time she sort of crops up, as she did in the recent Court of Appeal case only a few days ago, there's a sort of right-wing pile-on to say this wicked woman, and all the rest of it. But, I mean, frankly, I would have thought, I may be wrong, I've never seen opinion polling on the subject, that the majority of the people must feel, majority of the British public must feel slightly queasy about this now woman of 24. She was 15 when she went. She was probably a bit of a mixed-up kid. She was certainly trafficked. She was plunged into this nightmarish situation. And, I mean, I'm not criticising the court because I'm sure they were, correct in saying that Sajid Javid acted when he deprived her of citizenship within the law. But I think as a government decision, it was a very poor and very worrying one.
David?
So, look, I also understand the queasiness around the general principle of taking citizenship away from people. I also want to sort of distinguish between people who are children and people who went to, to join Daesh as adults. But, that segment we saw there, obviously you saw people in sort of camps and they talk about being in prison, but let's not lose sight of what Daesh was doing to people and the organisation that these people joined, often as adults. I mean, they imprisoned people, they tortured people, they sexually enslaved people. I think we have to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. I don't think we can say, Shamima Begum has gone through several sort of court hearings. And it does seem that, on balance, they have made the same decision again and again and again. I agree with Donald in that, taking citizenship away from everyone, from anybody, is in and of itself possibly a dangerous precedent. But let's not lose sight of the fact of the organisation that these people
Is it creating a sort of first-class, second-class situation? If you've got a citizenship coming from somewhere, if you have citizenship, as Shamima Begum does, then she gets her citizenship taken away and she's told, we'll go move to Bangladesh. Or is it, something more?
I mean, look, theoretically, yes, but I guess in this instance, it's like possibly you jeopardise it if you join Daesh, which is about the most extreme thing you can do. With Shamima Begum, the issue for me is that she was a child, and there you are legally, and my legal studies were a long time ago, and I was very bad at them. But, there is a precedent here. I mean, sorry, she was a child, and that is different because you are legally incapable of taking decisions. But in of itself, let's not lose sight of what some of these adults were doing during Daesh, the worst terror organisation of the last 30 years.
That's true, but, I think the reason that she went through all these hearings and has failed at each one of them is not really to do with the justice or morality of the case. It's to do with whether it was legal for the Home Secretary at the time to deprive her of citizenship. And, David, I see your point about doing things by case-by-case basis. And, of course, we don't want to import people from Daesh back to Britain, who David's quite right, you can't get any more extreme than that. But, there are children here. I mean, it seems to me absolutely crazy.
So then is there a responsibility to get the children back?
Definitely a responsibility
100%.
to get the children back. And in cases where, and I'm sure there are plenty of cases where it's certainly possible to kind of see the parents as not a security threat, and I don't believe for a moment that Shamima Begum is, although she doesn't fall, her children are dead. But where they're, where they're not an obvious security threat, then the parents should come with the children.
Donald, David, we're grateful for both of your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, a clash between water cannons and liquid manure. How a protest by farmers brought chaos to the streets of Brussels.
for me, the word disability is not negative. So if this is how loud we have to scream to get some answers, then I'm actually quite thrilled that it's happened. I think for a very, very long time, we've been coming into the workplace, shying away in another room, going through horrendous symptoms in some cases, but feeling like we can't talk to our employees about it. So for me, if this means we get more care, more support, a bit more understanding, I'm over the moon about it.
I think it makes for a great headline, and I don't mind that. So to give you some of the stats, 13 million women in the UK are currently in perimenopause or menopause. 50% of those women don't get any medical care at all. 25% of women in perimenopause or menopause consider leaving the workforce, and 10% actually do. So if we are now having this conversation, as an entrepreneur who's built and sold 4 businesses, we shouldn't ever write women off. Women's careers are not linear. Diverse teams produce better outcomes. And I think that the menopause and recognising the business of menopause and the economic contribution of women in perimenopause and menopause is really important.
An employee could effectively sue that employer. And just being a cynic and knowing how the world works, could that backfire, this headline that you welcome, Debbie? Because it may well put off employers employing mature women, which, let's face it, is a problem in the workplace anyway. Another excuse for men to write women off.
Well, this is the argument, isn't it?
It is the argument, but maybe this is just entrepreneurs are universally positive. You know, the glass is always half full or kind of overflowing onto the table. But couldn't we say that about women at any stage in the workforce? Haven't we been saying that about women who are of childbearing age? That they shouldn't be employed, that it's too difficult, that they can be sued, that maternity... I think, you know, it is far better for the conversation to be had and for the conversation to be had with men. Because throughout my career of building businesses that target the female audience, which is what I've done, as you know, we've got to bring men with us on the journey, right? We've got to bring men with us because the majority of economic power still sits with men.
How beautiful would it be to have that amazing conversation with your employer and for them to say, what do you need? What can I do to support you during this, let's be honest, in certain cases, very, very tricky part of your life? And then something amazing could happen. Welcome back. Water cannons fired in one direction and liquid manure the other. There was chaotic scenes in Brussels today as police clashed with angry farmers. We've covered this story on the programme before. Cheap imports and free trade deals are fueling their frustrations. And a meeting today bringing together agriculture ministers from across the EU proved a flashpoint. Let's just take a look at the images from today.
There is a lot of pressure to regulate and to change, but those pressures don't come with any better prices or any better income. So a lot of farmers are struggling to make ends meet.
Earlier we did have some pretty violent confrontations.
Over the years we've had many discussions with the politicians. Time and time over they've told us, we've heard you, we're gonna make things change. Many of us are really starting to feel desperate.
It's turned quite nasty between the protesters over there who are throwing fireworks, rocks, eggs, anything they can get their hands on, and the police who are using water cannon to try to control them.
Well, more protests over an issue that just isn't going away for farmers in Europe. We've seen demonstrations in Brussels, in Paris and in
Prague in the past few weeks, well, there's so much to discuss on that issue, and we have been following it with our correspondents on the ground. You can get more on that story on our website. It's at the usual place, www.sky.uk. So go there to learn more. And of course, we've discussed a range of issues, including that interview with Yuval Noah Harari, where he talks about the soul of his nation. You can learn more about that interview. We've got the full interview on YouTube, so do go there too. That's all for tonight's programme. Thanks for watching. News at 10 is up next.